Okay, thank you, Rachel. And thank you to everyone who is joining and lending me your ear and a bit of your time to learn about pollinator habitat and how we can integrate that into our towns and cities. First, I want to start with saying thank you to our Xerces Society supporters and our partners. We are a nonprofit, member-supported organization, so we absolutely could not do what we do without our wonderful members and our myriad of partners who come to the table to help us out and to help us help these little animals out. I want to say thank you. Wanted to briefly give you a little bit of background about the Xerces Society. Our full name is the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and our slogan is protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. We were founded back in 1971, and we're a small organization, but we do seem to keep growing. So right now we're an organization of about 50 folks. Our headquarters office is in Portland, Oregon, but we do have regional offices across the country. You might wonder where the name Xerces comes from. It's a bit odd, and certainly people sometimes have a hard time pronouncing it. But we're named after the Xerces blue butterfly. That is the first butterfly in the U.S. that is known to go extinct due to human activities. So, in order to achieve our mission of protecting invertebrates and their habitats, we use a variety of different strategies and avenues. First of all, the animals that we are working to protect are specifically pollinators, beneficial insects, which falls under the concept of conservation biocontrol. And beneficial insects are invertebrates that are natural predators or parasitoids of other invertebrate pest species. Aquatic invertebrates certainly are within our mission as well, so things like mussels. And we have a variety of groups within Xerces that work within different sectors. Agricultural biodiversity team is the team that I'm lucky enough to be a part of. And through that avenue, we work with specifically farmers and ranchers around the country to help them integrate pollinator conservation into their operations. And in doing so, we partner with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. We have a whole group of folks that work on threatened and endangered invertebrate species, another group of people who work on pesticide issues, and then we certainly work on urban conservation as well, and Bee City and Bee Campus USA are some of our urban initiatives. Be Better Certified is a program that we have going that specifically works with farmers to help them become Be Better Certified, and in doing so, they adopt farming management practices that are pollinator friendly. And then we have a variety of community science efforts going as well. I wanted to start out today with kind of the uplifting and what I find to be the really encouraging message of pollinator conservation. We all hear about large vertebrate animals that are in trouble, that need our help. Polar bears, grizzly bears, wolves, bald eagles, although recently their numbers have turned around due to great conservation efforts. But these are all large vertebrate animals that need a lot of space in order to complete their life histories and to reproduce. But pollinators are a different ballgame. They are small animals, and so therefore they can be, their life needs can be met on a variety of habitat scales. And that, I think, especially as a wildlife biologist, is such an encouraging message, because that really does mean that small spatial efforts, like what you could do in your backyard, or even if you don't have a yard, if you have a balcony and you could put a flower box out, that really does help these small creatures out and helps move the needle in a positive direction. And so that, I think, is an empowering fact that puts pollinator conservation really into the hands of all of us. And I love this quote: ecological warriors of the future won't be just scientists and engineers, but instead it's going to be gardeners, horticulturalists, land managers, landscape architects, transportation department staff, elementary school teachers, and community association board members. Really, anyone who can influence a small patch of land can help these creatures out. I think that's a great message that we should focus on and kind of keep in mind as we move forward today. So the importance of invertebrates: this is a hugely diverse group of animals. They're sometimes a bit wacky and beautiful and crazy, all at the same time. They're really a fascinating group of creatures. And like most things in life, a few bad apples can give a lot of great a great group a bad name. And that's certainly true for our invertebrates. Only a small fraction, about 2% of insects are considered pests, be it agricultural pests or disease vectoring pests like mosquitoes or ticks. The rest of the invertebrate world are beneficial to humans, or they are important to our food webs. This quote might seem like a bit of an overstatement, but once we talk about it and you think about it, you'll realize that it's really not. The fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. Sorry about that. So ways that these small animals that are so easily overlooked, and therefore I feel like we humans easily can take them for granted, actually do impact our daily lives. They contribute to soil health by recycling nutrients throughout the ecosystem. They're out there breaking down leaf litter and detritus, making those nutrients available to plants that can then uptake those nutrients and grow. They offer free pest control services. Again, as I mentioned, through predators and parasitoids. They are preying on pest invertebrates. They also are a substantial food source for other animals. Up to 89% of birds feed on invertebrates as a major part of their diet. I have a picture here of a pheasant here in the northern Great Plains. Pheasants are a bird that we're all familiar with. And certainly when you're creating pollinator habitat, you also are supporting other species of wildlife in doing so. For instance, pollinator habitat is great habitat for pheasant broods or chicks of pheasants. And then probably the most impactful way that pollinators and invertebrates impact our daily lives is by helping plants reproduce. 85% of our terrestrial plants require pollinators in order to reproduce. And so, of course, that has major impacts on fruit and seed set and our human diets and nutrition needs. So the best way to convey this message, I think, is to use a picture. So as I mentioned, pollinator-dependent fruits are really vital to human nutrition. Most of our vitamins and minerals that we need come from pollinator-dependent fruits. This is a produce section of what we're used to seeing these days in grocery stores. There's abundant options, abundant quantities, and just a huge diversity of fruits and vegetables available to us. But if pollinators were to disappear overnight, this is what our produce section would be reduced to. We have single-handedly lost fruits like apples, strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, vegetables like pumpkins, squash, eggplant. A lot of the fruits and vegetables that we need disappear. Not to mention other things like coffee, tea, chocolate that you wouldn't find in the produce aisle, but that we all really enjoy, rely on pollinators. Another part of the grocery store that's impacted by pollinators that might not be as obvious is the dairy aisle. You might think, what in the world? Our dairy products come from milk. Milk comes from cows. Well, our dairy cattle are fed primarily alfalfa as their forage, and alfalfa requires pollinators. So if pollinators were to disappear overnight, this is what our dairy aisle would look like. Not only is the quantity of dairy items reduced, but also a lot of the flavorings that we love in our yogurts, like vanilla, strawberry, blackberry, blueberries, raspberries, chocolate, all of those would not be available to us without our pollinators. So a way to kind of summarize this is that 1 in every 3 bites of food and drink requires the presence of a pollinator. So the term pollinators is something that you've probably heard thrown around a good bit these days, and you might wonder, well, who really makes up the pollinator groups? There certainly are a couple of groups of vertebrate pollinators. Bats come to mind, hummingbirds, but by and large, the majority of our pollinators are invertebrate pollinators. And there's 6 kind of subgroups that make up the invertebrate pollinator world: bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths. And of those 6 groups, by far and away, the most efficient and effective group of pollinators are bees. They're just really built to move pollen around. They have fuzzy little bodies. They're very efficient foragers. They're, kind of on a mission when they're out looking for their food. They're just really great pollinators. And we have a tremendous diversity of native wild bees, nearly 3,600 species of native bees in the US alone. And if we add into that equation Canada and Mexico, we end up with 5,000 species of native bees in North America. So we have cuckoo bees, mining bees, sweat bees, bumblebees. The list really does go on and on. One species you might have noticed I didn't mention is the honeybee. Something that folks, I think, it's easy for us to forget is that honeybees are actually not native to the US. They were introduced to North America back in the 1620s when Europeans were coming to the New World. They wanted their honey, so they brought their honeybees with them. The analogy that I really like to use is that honeybees are to our native wild bees like chickens are to our native wild grouse of the Great Plains. They are a domesticated species. Honeybees are managed for humans by humans, and they are bred for disease and pesticide resistance. So again, you've probably heard a good bit about pollinators these days. It's in the media a lot, and the reason for that is that there is overwhelming amount of evidence that our managed pollinators, meaning our honeybees, as well as our wild pollinators, are declining. That, of course, begs the question of why. And like any conservation issue, it's not a simple, straightforward answer. It's complex and multifaceted. Habitat loss is contributing to their declines as we develop our wild spaces into urban areas, as we convert our grasslands to cropland, and even as we remove field windbreaks to enlarge crop fields. Not only are those field windbreaks really important to reducing erosion, but they also provide some really important wildlife habitat, not only to other species, but they can be really important to pollinators as well. Pesticide use. We do use a good bit of pesticides these days for mosquito control, for home and garden uses, as well as for agricultural uses. Disease is an issue as well. As we move bees and butterflies around the country, that means that we can potentially be moving diseases with them. And our managed pollinators, our honeybees, do get moved around the country quite a bit. And then invasive species are also an issue as introduced plants invade our native plant communities, drives the biodiversity of those plant communities down, and that certainly impacts pollinators. So while the situation may seem bleak, you actually have more power than you think. Creating habitat is absolutely one of the most important actions that we can take, and it's really not terribly difficult. As I mentioned at the beginning, some animals have a minimum area requirement for suitable habitat. They need large tracts of land, but pollinator habitat can be created on a variety of scales. And I do want to emphasize that variety of scales. When I talk about how helpful small spaces can be to our pollinators, that's very true, but I don't mean to take away from our vast acres of our native rolling prairies that we have in the northern plains either. Those are also essential to pollinators and provide great pollinator habitat. We have some pollinator species that absolutely require those native prairies or rangelands in order to survive. But again, I think it's so so uplifting that these small spaces can really contribute to pollinator species conservation. And don't underestimate the power of local efforts. Local efforts can really combine to make big impacts. And there's also numerous additional benefits to bringing pollinator habitat into our towns and cities. The one that I wanted to really mention here is that, yes, our towns and cities can be important to invertebrates, but I also really believe that invertebrates are important to our towns and cities. And here's why. Insects are some of the most accessible forms of wildlife that people can experience, especially in our urban areas. At no point in human history have we ever been more urbanized. More people live in towns and cities than ever before. And what that results in is us humans becoming more disconnected from our natural world. But by installing pollinator habitat into our towns and cities, we can encourage these small, wonderful little creatures to come in to our backyards, to our downtowns, to our school yards, and we get a chance to interact with these little guys. And I love this picture. This beautiful little girl is so intently studying this bumblebee, and then she's even here on the right able to pet the bumblebee. So not only does this show that not all bees are out to sting you, but it just shows that up-close interaction that we can have and how impactful that can be. And please don't think that only our curious little kiddos are excited by pollinators, because I get the great privilege of working with a lot of ranchers, and I've seen some of the most stoic, salt of the earth ranchers really get excited when you take a sweep net out into their rangelands and their pastures and you catch a few bumblebees and you hold them up close to them and start talking to them about those animals. Their faces really light up with curiosity and wonder. So don't underestimate the power of these small creatures and what they, the curiosity that they can light up in us. So, what are the habitat requirements for pollinators? It's really quite simple. There's three things. They need food, they need shelter, and they need to not be killed in their habitats. So their food would be flowers and host plants. Their shelter is required for nesting and overwintering, and then they need refuge from pesticides. So I'm going to talk about each of those factors. The first one being food, flowers and host plants. So pollinators need blooming flowers all growing season long to feed themselves and their young. So they need flowers that bloom in the spring, the summer, and the fall. And specifically, the parts of the flower that they need are pollen as their protein source and nectar as their carbohydrate source. So think of pollen as their big juicy steaks, and nectar is their breads, their grains, their desserts. Caterpillars of butterflies and moths need host plants. Probably the most familiar example of this is the monarch butterfly and how the monarch caterpillars absolutely have to have milkweed in order to complete their life cycle. And then when you're supporting native pollinators, it's best to plant native flowers and grasses. So you might think, well, we have a lot of flowers blooming out on the landscape. It's curious to me that these pollinators are struggling. Well, just because we have plants blooming everywhere, that doesn't really necessarily mean that those flowers are providing that much habitat or forage to these pollinators. The reason being is that many of our ornamentals are exactly that. We've bred them to be showy and beautiful to us humans, and a lot of times in doing so, we have given them double petals in place of anthers, so that a lot of those flowers don't even have pollen, or if they do, it's very little. Oftentimes we've altered the flower structure so much to make it pretty to us humans that nectar is inaccessible to these little creatures. Another thing about ornamentals is that they aren't locally adapted, especially if you're living in the western part of the Great Plains. You have drier environments, and I don't know about you, but I typically don't like to spend a lot of our valuable resource of water, not to mention the cost of paying for a lot of water, to douse on some flowers in my yard. I would much rather they be able to hack it in my local conditions. And that is a really nice thing about our native plants, is that they are drought tolerant, they are locally adapted. And then also it's important to make sure that plants are not pre-treated with insecticides, and that's something that happens more than you might realize. So you might be wondering, this is all great, but how in the world would I start? I'm interested in doing this, but where do I start to choose flowers? I would say this: if you have an area in mind that you would like to put in some native flowers, take note of the site characteristics. What amount of sun does that area get? Does it get full sun, part sun, or is it more shade dominant? What are the water requirements? How much water do you want to give to these plants? And also, if you live in a wetter part of the Great Plains, then you obviously want to make sure that those plants that you're planting and spending time and energy and money on can tolerate those wetter conditions. Consider the soil type of the area you're wanting to plant. And then also really importantly here in the Northern Great Plains is to consider the USDA plant hardiness zone. And that here is the link for where you can find this map. It's just really important, again, in our harsh winters, that the plants that you choose can overwinter and survive our winters. Focus on native perennial plants. We have some great native annual plants as well, but perennial plants will come back year after year, which is a nice thing. Plant diversity is important, but by all means, don't hear that and think, oh my goodness, I need to plant 20 different species of flowers, and that just seems like too much. Start small. If you can only do 3 different species of flowers, one that blooms in the spring, one in the summer, and one in the fall, that's great. Starting small is key. And then again, bloom throughout the growing season is really important. You want things that bloom in the early, mid, and late part of the growing season. So, grasses, our native grasses, are really important to pollinator habitat for 2 reasons. One, they provide nesting habitat. Our bunch grasses specifically are really excellent nesting habitat for bumblebees. And then if you are planting from seed, our native grasses are really important for weed suppression during the establishment phase. Our native wildflowers will often take a little bit longer to come up from seed, whereas our native grasses will start to grow from seed quicker. So they can come up in your planting and start to suppress weeds that you'll have coming in during the establishment phase. Include butterfly and moth host plants. Consider the ease of establishment. Again, if you're just getting started with this type of gardening and you don't have much of a green thumb developed yet, that's okay. Choose plants that are easier to grow and get your confidence up and go from there and learn from there. Availability and cost is certainly something to consider. Our typical box stores aren't going to have, rarely are they going to have native plants. However, if you go to our Xerces Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, and I've provided the link here, you will find a list of native plant vendors, and we've broken it down by region. So if you go to the North Central region, which is here, then you can find native plant vendor list. And often they are a great place to start. And a lot of times you can talk to them about pesticide-free seed or plants, and they will generally have more answers for you than a lot of the box stores might. So again, I just wanted to bring one particular resource that we have at our Pollinator Resource Center to your attention. I've gone ahead and provided the link up here in the top right, specific to our region, the North Central. And I wanted to recommend as a great starting place for y'all the pollinator plants of the Northern Plains region. This is the front cover of this document. But what I think is the powerful part of this document is actually pages 2 and 3. So I've just included a little excerpt here. As you can see, we've listed different forbs or wildflower species by their bloom period, either the early, the mid, or the late. We've listed the common name, the scientific name, flower color, maximum height of that flower, the water needs of that plant species, and the pertinent notes that we thought would be helpful for y'all to have. And then also we have corresponded a number for each species with a picture so that you have an idea of what you are considering planting. So again, I feel like a bit of a broken record at this point, but season-long bloom is really important to be sure to provide food for these animals throughout the growing season. So select species that have overlapping bloom times from the spring, summer, to the fall. So here's some pictures just to give you some examples of early blooming species in the Northern Great Plains. This is penstemon, and then Plains Coreopsis is here in the back. Down in Nebraska, the redbud will bloom. Beautiful tree. I really love that one. In the summer, we have wild bergamot or bee balm, and vervain will bloom. Prairie coneflower, purple coneflower. And then in the fall, you'll get more asters. So we have New England aster here, as well as some blanket flower. And blanket flower is one what actually blooms in the summer and the fall. It's a bit of an overlapping bloom period. We have giant blue hyssop, prairie coneflower. Oh, and liatris is starting to, blazing star is starting to bloom here in the front. So some wildflowers that I would recommend just based on my own experience, if these species are suitable to your site conditions. So again, remember water requirements sun exposure, soil type, and USDA plant hardiness zone. False sunflower is one I really like. It provides a lot of great pollen and nectar for pollinators, and it's not too costly of a flower. I think it's really pretty. Canada anemone is an important one I find, especially in our cities and towns. That is a shade-tolerant native prairie plant. As you can imagine, most of our native prairie plants are not very shade tolerant. They have adapted to the wide open prairies where they don't have to deal with shade. So when we find shade tolerant native plants, I tend to really log that away in my head. And Canada anemone has been my best friend in some urban plantings. Giant blue hyssop and cup plant are phenomenal, the amount of pollinators that you'll get visiting these plants. It's really impressive. One neat fact about cup plant that I've noticed, it gets its name by the way that the leaves cup around the stem. And that actually I've seen native bees I've seen native bees resting down in that little cup that the plant creates. So they use that as shelter as well. So cup plant provides great nectar and pollen as well as some shelter. And then our dotted and meadow blazing star is often called dotted gay feather, meadow gay feather. That is this plant pictured here. I believe this is probably meadow blazing star. And not only do I think they're beautiful flowers, but in my experience, at least in the fall, come about August, you don't have to stand at blazing star for too long before a monarch will find it and come and nectar on the flowers, just like pictured here. And then Plains Coreopsis, that's this flower here. That is a native annual, but it is pretty easy to get established. And I just think it's a beautiful plant that, again, provides great resources for pollinators and our beneficial insects. One species I wanted to mention that isn't as valuable to pollinators as we might think, but still, I believe, has a place in pollinator habitat is black-eyed Susan. It just doesn't provide as much pollen and nectar as we wish that it would to pollinators, because black-eyed Susan is a species that's pretty easy to grow. Now, that being said, if you like the look of black-eyed Susan, if you want to have some of that, by all means, put a few plants in your yard or in your pollinator habitat. I do think it has a place for, human morale. For if you like that plant, by all means, you should put some in. Just understand that it's not providing as much pollen and nectar to our pollinators as you might think. Another really important way to provide early spring pollen and nectar is through our flowering trees and shrubs. So even though we are prairie states, we often do have a lot of trees in our urban areas, which is good news for pollinators, because when they are coming out of their overwintering sites, they are really hungry and pretty desperate for pollen and nectar, but there's not much that's blooming on the landscape. However, our trees and shrubs do. In particular, willows come to mind. They produce a lot of pollen at a very early point in the year. They also provide nesting resources for stem nesting insects. Species such as elderberry and wild rose will do that. Obviously, our trees and shrubs provide wind protection as well, not only for us humans, but for our pollinators as well. There are pollinator species that don't tolerate really high winds or windy conditions, so trees and shrubs can help provide some wind protection for them. And then certainly, our trees and shrubs can provide harvestable fruit for us, such as elderberry. So some native flowering trees and shrubs of the northern Great Plains I wanted to mention are willows, box elder, sumacs, golden currant, plum, western sand cherry, bled plant, false indigo, woods rose, and four-winged saltbush. I mentioned briefly earlier the importance of our native grasses and how important it is to include those in pollinator habitat. They provide shelter as well as can be host plants for some butterfly species. They also provide really great overwintering sites for pollinators. And as I mentioned, nest sites for bumblebees. The two species that really come to mind of our native grasses, bunch grasses, is little bluestem and green needle. Little bluestem, I think, is great to include in urban plantings, or in general, urban or rural, because it's got a really tight bunch structure that's great nesting habitat for bumblebees. but it also will turn this really beautiful reddish orange in the fall that I think we humans tend to like. At least I like the look of it. And then you don't want to cut those grasses back in the fall. You would leave them standing throughout the winter, and it can provide some nice winter interest as those native grasses do tend to poke up above the snow. Native grasses provide structural diversity in plantings. And then also it's really impressive the root systems that our native grasses have. And so they are excellent at reducing erosion and helping water infiltrate into the soil profile and reaching our groundwater. Also want to include host plants for the eggs and caterpillars of butterflies and moths, as well as nectar plants. And if this is a topic that really interests you, then I would recommend the Xerces Society book, Gardening for Butterflies. It really digs into this topic and has some great resources for y'all. Okay, so that's the food part, one of 3 parts of habitat. So that's the food. Now we'll talk about nesting and overwintering sites. First, let's briefly mention the native bee nesting behaviors. So about 1% of our native bees are bumblebees. And again, they typically will use our native bunch grasses as nesting sites. About 30% of our native bees are stem or tunnel nesting bees. And then about 70% of our native bees are ground nesting bees. And the good news about this is that it's pretty simple to provide nesting habitat for all of those different types of nesters. And again, you can do it in a small space. So just providing bare ground, so no weed barrier fabric, no plastic mulch, nothing like that, just bare ground provides great opportunities for nesting for ground nesting bees. You might think that this picture here in the bottom left is an anthill, and that's certainly what it could look like at first glance, but that is actually a ground nesting bee nest. Rock and brush piles, even just a small one in corner of the yard, can provide some great resources, overwintering resources, as well as maybe some stem nesting resources. Bunch grasses are great nesting sites for our bumblebees, and then woody and pithy stems provide good stem nesting sites for our stem nesting bees. So this picture here is of purple coneflower, or Echinacea angustifolia, and these stems are hollow. When the flower head is cut off, you'll notice that it's hollow inside, and so that provides a great resource for stem nesting to come along and perhaps hollow out the stem a little bit more and use that for nesting. And then winter cover is so important here in the Northern Great Plains and is so easy to provide. So just leaving vegetation standing, just like this, can be really great and essential overwintering habitat for these small creatures. Leaf litter, for instance, is a great and essential overwintering habitat for a lot of our pollinators, as well as beneficial insects. So those insects that are preying and feeding upon other insect pests. And then the third habitat requirement is refuge from pesticides. So by no means am I saying that pesticides are evil or that they have no place in our world. I 100% recognize that they do have a place. What I would strongly encourage you to do is to use these chemicals wisely and to be thoughtful about using them. So before you just go and reach for a bottle of insecticide, herbicide, or even fungicide, consider the impacts to non-target species, such as our pollinators, our beneficial insects that are providing pest control, and then also the wildflowers that you've worked so hard to grow in your pollinator habitat. A lot of our native wildflowers can be quite sensitive to herbicide, so you want to be very conscientious of using these things. And pesticides can impact pollinators through a variety of pathways. They don't have to be sprayed in order to be impacted. So one way that bees or pollinators can be impacted is by being sprayed directly, like here on the far left. They can also collect contaminated nest materials. If a bee visits a flower that was previously sprayed, that's another way that they can be impacted by pesticides. Nest sites can be directly contaminated by spray. And then the one on the far right, I think, is probably the least obvious pathway of exposure, but it's an important one. So plants absorb pesticides through the soil, and then they take that up through their roots into the plant, and their pollen and nectar can get contaminated that way, which then can have impacts on our pollinators. So that's the 3 habitat requirements: food, shelter, and refuge from pesticides. How do we bring these features to our cities and towns? And again, the good news is that it's pretty simple to do. So I love this graphic. It gives a good bird's eye view of all the different things that we just discussed and ways that they can be integrated into our neighborhoods if they aren't already there. And I think a lot of these features are probably already present. Things like fruit trees, vegetable gardens. I think a lot of people have vegetable gardens, and I think the pandemic might even increase the interest that we see in the country of vegetable gardens. Flowering shrubs, shade-loving flowers. Remember, Canada anemone could be your best friend in a lot of shady areas. Prairie pockets, either if you're interested in doing a little bit of a prairie planting in your yard, or that maybe sounds like a bit too much, you could also think about integrating that into some of your municipal parks, like there's pictured here. That's number 5. Ground nesting bees, just providing bare ground is such a simple thing we can do to help these bees out. Flowering curbs, rain gardens, becoming more and more popular in our urban areas. Native bee lawns, and flowering medians. It's always nice to have something flowering instead of just grasses. And it's also a great way to integrate pollinator habitat into our cities and towns. And then cavity nesting bees, just leaving some stems available for our stem nesters can be really helpful. So again, you don't need large acreage to help pollinators out. But I did want to give you a few guidelines for small spaces and things to kind of consider. Select a few of the best species for your site, again, that are suitable to the site, sun, water requirements, etc. Avoid aggressive species. When you're working in small spaces, you don't want a few aggressive species to really take over the site. Clump plant species together to help pollinators find them more easily. So if you think about it from the perspective of the pollinator, a bee is flying around and let's say prairie coneflower happens to be blooming at that time. Well, if you have one prairie coneflower here and then you planted another one 10 feet away and then another one 15 feet away, it's harder for them to find what's blooming. Whereas if you just clump all 3 of those prairie coneflower species together, you've kind of made their target or their bullseye bigger so they can find the blooming flower easier. Consider shrubs and trees for not only structural diversity to make it interesting to us humans, but also provides more habitat niches for pollinators. Make sure that your plants are not pre-treated with insecticides. Maintain borders and edges. That's certainly something we humans care about. Our pollinators don't, but it makes our pollinator habitat in towns and cities more appealing to our eyes, which is great. And then include other people features like benches and sitting areas. Consider converting your lawn to something more useful. This number just blows my mind. Over 40 million acres of lawn exist in the US, which makes turf the single largest irrigated crop in the country. And that, that is mind-boggling to me. Not only the amount of water that we spend on our lawns, our very valuable water resources, but also, my goodness, what we could do with 40 million acres of habitat, not just for pollinators, but for many, many wildlife species. That really can add up. So as you can imagine, the monoculture lawn that you see pictured here on the left supports far fewer wildlife species, far fewer pollinators, beneficial insects, and songbirds than the flowering native plants that are pictured on the right. And then here's some pictures of some lawns with native plants in the northern Great Plains. Just to give you an idea, by all means, it doesn't mean you have to convert all of your lawn. As you can see, both of these homes have chosen to keep some of their lawns. Lawns are nice to have for kids and pets and for a variety of reasons. But if you can incorporate native plants into that, it can really be helpful for our pollinators. Other things to consider in your lawn and garden are fruiting and flowering trees and shrubs like blueberry, raspberry, elderberry, currants, and apple. And then also garden herbs, so mint, cilantro, dill, oregano, like I mentioned before. Even if you don't have a yard, but if you have a balcony, you could put a flower box out. Consider planting some of those herbs. They can spice up your cooking, but also provide habitat for forage for our pollinators. Our lawns, parks, and residences can bloom, and I know this is a tough one because we've all been taught that dandelions and clovers and violets are weeds, and it is a lazy man's lawn to let his lawn grow up high and bloom. We've all been conditioned to think that that just looks terrible, but it can provide a lot of resources for our pollinators. So if you mow high, look for bee nesting, and protect those areas from pesticides can provide great habitat. So look at this. This is a great example of just the sheer amount of bloom on the landscape and the size of this. And all that these homeowners had to do was nothing. They did less, and it provided more for our pollinators. And that is another theme of pollinator conservation that's really nice. So they didn't have to go out and plant this. They simply didn't fire up the mower as frequently. They saved time and energy and provided a lot of resource to our pollinators. The same concept goes to providing shelter for nesting and overwintering sites in our urban areas for pollinators. So leave the leaves and save the stems. So again, doing less on our part really can provide more for pollinators. So by saving the stems, if you skip the fall tidy up that we're all kind of used to doing, and you leave the leaves in place and you don't trim back those stems, you can provide nesting sites for bees and wasps. And then by leaving the leaves, you're providing really important pupation and overwintering sites for butterflies, moths, beetles, and flies. A few guidelines for leaving the leaves. I think the slogan is probably pretty clear as it is, but you can leave a thin layer of leaves on grassy areas, spread on vegetable or flower beds for soil building and weed protection. You can pile some leaves around ornamental trees, shrubs, and perennials, and avoid shredding the leaves. And I wanted to include this picture. It's such a beautiful picture of fritillary butterflies. And by leaving the leaves, you are providing really essential overwintering habitat for these creatures, for the caterpillars of these butterflies. And that's just one example of many pollinators that need overwintering habitat in leaf litter. Rain gardens and bioswales, I mentioned that earlier. These are becoming more and more popular in urban areas because it's so important to capturing runoff and improving our water quality. And it is a great place to put in some native flowers that will provide nectar and pollen and nesting sites for our pollinators. Utility corridors and roadsides can also provide multiple benefits to pollinators. So a lot of this you might be noticing is just rethinking the spaces that we already have. So by putting in flowers in spaces that we already have, we can really make some big impacts. And again, sometimes it doesn't even mean putting in flowers. It just means allowing the flowers that are already there to bloom. Our public parks can offer great habitat and education opportunities. So people will notice that these are different plants planted here. They're not the typical ornamentals they're used to seeing. And I think that including some signs to educate the public on what they're looking at, the goal of the planting, and what pollinators are currently facing is really important to helping get the word out. And then building connections, I think, is so important. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. I think that's very true when it comes to building pollinator habitat in our urban areas. So in building connections and community support, you can engage your neighbors, again, by creating signage that helps educate others. Like I said, people really do notice when there's something different planted as they're on their daily walk around the neighborhood. And so if you put up a sign explaining what's going on there, they will take note. Talk to your neighbors about the benefits of pollinator conservation. I will say that it's pretty interesting once you start talking about this topic, how many other people are either already interested in it, or it's very easy to convince them that this is a worthwhile effort. Offer native plant garden tours if you have a local garden club. They might be very interested in learning more about native plants, and maybe if you're open to it, bringing them over to your yard or any place where there are some native plants planted around town to discuss the merits of those plants. And then collaborate on habitat projects. Involving schools and kids is a great way to educate the next generation. Most kids enjoy playing in the dirt and the soil, so it's great to get them involved in plantings and concentrate bloom for when students are present, so the spring and the late summer and early fall. You can include herbs and inexpensive cover on fallowed beds and on corners. And again, as you build connections and community support, you might realize how much pollinator conservation efforts are already going on in your town. And it's kind of just a question of bringing all of those efforts together, kind of making an umbrella under which all of these different efforts can coincide. And that is where Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA can come in. These are Xerces Society's initiatives. Bee City is for our cities, towns, villages, and counties, and Bee Campus is applicable for our college and university campuses. Here's a map of our current cities and campuses. City is in green, campuses are in blue. And I have circled the north central region, and as you can see, folks, we're a bit sparse in this area, but I know we can change that, and it's pretty simple to do so. But you might be wondering, well, what all is required in order to become a bee city? Creating and enhancing pollinator habitat on public and private lands. So again, doing the three things we just talked about: providing food for them, providing shelter, providing them refuge from pesticides. So including creating an IPM plan. IPM is Integrated Pest Management Plan, and native plant and native plant suppliers. Again, just providing habitat like we've just discussed. City or county policies and plans, pollinator conscious. Host pollinator events. Acknowledge Bee City USA's affiliation with signs and an online presence. Annually apply for renewal and report on last year's activities, and pay an initial application and annual renewal fees. So there's a lot of different ways to go about this. I've heard folks say that no two bee cities are alike. There's plenty of room for creative ideas. Like I've heard many different ideas thrown out for hosting pollinator awareness events. So it can be a really fun process. Joining existing efforts, so you don't have to start at square one. Again, as you start talking to folks about these ideas, you'll be surprised at the amount of existing efforts that are already ongoing. So engaging students and volunteers is a great way to get kids exposed to environmental education and to get them involved with volunteer activities. Joining Bumblebee Watch is another thing you can do. It's easy to use and it's fun. You go to the website here in the bottom left corner, bumblebeewatch.org, and you take a photo of a bumblebee that you happen to see foraging on a flower just like this. Log in to bumblebeewatch.org and upload your photo. You would then use our online resources to identify the species, and then an expert will come along and verify the sighting, and that sighting then goes into a worldwide database that helps scientists understand more about bumblebee distributions and their statuses. Passing local policies. This is obviously more of a group effort, but it certainly can be done. Finding local support is important. Engaging park departments is actually not as daunting as you might think. A lot of pollinator habitat efforts, like I just mentioned, less is more. And parks departments are often really very, very busy with maintaining the areas that they have. So if you can talk to them about putting in some different habitat that would require less mowing, less maintenance, then they might be all ears for that. So that can be a really great avenue to seek out, is engaging parks departments, gain support from a city council member, get in the media, speak at public meetings, and then celebrate. It's really easy to celebrate pollinator conservation because essentially it's making areas in town prettier, putting in flowers, and that's a pretty easy thing to celebrate and to sell folks on. Look into ways that urban habitat change is incentivized in your area. I really encourage you to look into your local soil conservation districts. I know of several soil conservation districts that have urban programs that provide financial assistance to homeowners that want to install pollinator-friendly plantings in their lawns, that are interested in xeriscaping, which is a fancy word to say putting in drought-tolerant native plants. Again, from the soil conservation district's perspective, they're trying to encourage folks to use water wisely and to save water by planting drought-tolerant plants. Rain barrels or rain gardens are another initiative that might be supported through financial assistance from your local soil conservation district. Also, public art can highlight pollinators and kind of bring that to the forefront of the public's mind. It connects people, plants, pollinators, and places. So if you are an artist or you have connections with such groups, then consider this as a way to kind of bring awareness to pollinators. And I dare say, now that I've mentioned that, you might notice that there's actually more pollinators already in art around town than you realize. And again, it's an easy sell. They're beautiful creatures that we enjoy painting. One example I wanted to give today is pollinator planting that I was involved in downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. I think probably one of the overarching themes here is that Rome wasn't built in a day. It was a process that took probably about a year and a half or more. And it was very much an organic process. It started with one conversation with one person, and then went to a meeting. Another person heard about pollinator conservation and approached the group and said, hey, I'm interested. And so we had a couple of meetings and we brainstormed all the different people that needed to be involved. And 4 to 6 meetings later, we had developed a good core group of people that represented a different number of entities that were important to have at the table. And once we got the right people at the table, things really started to happen. We found out that there were spaces and flower beds that needed planting that were available for planting. Again, through that networking, which is so key, we were able to secure funding. And then also because of networking, we were able to work with a landscape designer, a landscape architect to help with the aesthetic appeal of these plantings. So if left to my own devices as a wildlife biologist, I'm probably going to make pollinator habitat look like our native prairies that I love to roam around in, which is quite a wild look. As you can imagine, most municipalities probably, and very understandably so, would want things to look a little more manicured. And so it was great that we were able to find a landscape architect to donate her time and skills to making this planting more appealing to the general public. Find pesticide-free plants or seeds, and then get the community involved to plant. There's a lot of legwork and heavy lifting and phone calls and paperwork involved leading up to the planting, but the planting is the fun part, and it's a great way to get Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts involved, or wildlife clubs, garden clubs, just bring folks out within the community to plant. And I think that's a great way to give the community more ownership in that planting. And then work with the park or city managers to discuss the long-term management of those plantings and the pesticide-free management that would need to be used. And then so importantly, I believe, is to post signs to explain the goal of the planting and to educate the public, especially in these highly visible places like a downtown area. There's now a sign in each of these flower beds explaining to the public the importance of our native prairies, the importance of our pollinators, and what the goal is of each of these plantings. And as you can see here below this sign, this is a large group of people who came together to make these plantings happen. So Rome wasn't built in a day, and it wasn't built by one person. It really was a huge collaborative effort of some really great people making this happen. So I wanted to mention briefly some downloadable resources that we have at Xerces.org. We have a lot of resources available to y'all, so please check them out if you're interested. One I wanted to particularly highlight is Habitat Assessment Guide for Pollinators in Yards, Gardens, and Parks. This is a great, another great starting place. It'll help you step-by-step go through and assess what pollinator habitat you might already have, what resources you might already be providing to pollinators, and some other areas that you could maybe increase to provide more for pollinators. A few books by the Xerces Society I wanted to mention: Attracting Native Pollinators, 100 Plants to Feed the Bees, Gardening for Butterflies, as I've already mentioned, and then Farming with Native Beneficial Insects. These are really great resources, and they are available for purchase. Connect and learn with us, please, on our YouTube channel and on social media. And then please help spread the word. If you like what you've heard today, if you're interested in this, please consider becoming a Xerces Society member. As I mentioned right off the bat, we are a nonprofit, donor-supported, member-supported organization. And so we really cannot do what we do without y'all, without your help. So please consider donating today to receive your pollinator habitat sign pictured here on the right and a 1-year membership to Xerces.